It's now 5 o'clock. If you please give your attention to the emergency evacuation announcement.
Before we get started, let me read the emergency evacuation procedures. In the event of an emergency evacuation, an alarm will sound. Everyone should exit the building by way of the nearest stairwell in a safe and effective manner. If the nearest stairwell is blocked by smoke, use the other stairwell. Do not use the elevator. Once you have reached the main floor, follow the exit signs to exit the building and quickly proceed away from the building. Please be mindful of others evacuating and of emergency vehicles.
At this time, will the members please register your presence by voting yes?
There are 19 present and 2 absent. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Commissioner French is not with us this evening, and I ask that all members and members assembled here tonight, this afternoon, remember him in your prayers and his family. He has a family member that received some bad medical news today. Commissioner Kaler just called. He is en route, should be joining us shortly. At this time, the clerk will read the call.
Call for a special meeting of the Blount County Board of Commissioners to be held in room 430 at the Blount County Courthouse, Court Street, Maryville, Tennessee, on Thursday, September 19th, 2013, at 5 p.m. Pursuant to and in accordance with the authority vested in me by Tennessee Code Annotated, Section 5-5-105, I hereby call the Board of County Commissioners of Blount County, Tennessee, to meet in special session on the 19th day of September 2013, 5 p.m. and adjourning on or before 6 p.m. in room 430 of the Blount County Courthouse, Court Street, Maryville, Tennessee, for a presentation on debt from Public Financial Management, PFM, Blount County's financial advisor.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This time, Chair recognizes Randy Vineyard.
Thank you. The presentation will be loaded here briefly, but I've got some comments that I kind of want to frame the context of the discussion for this special meeting. One, I want to thank each of the commissioners who took the time to come and sit down and go through the presentation that I showed. The presentation was exactly the same presentation that was made to the state of Tennessee in August. As I told each of you during our conversation and the briefing, there would be refinements or changes or alterations only to our favor that would be made from the time this was actually presented to you that's in the packet today, and would be updated with those refinements and adjustments and corrections. Even if you approve tonight the recommendation that we are making, there will still be other minor alterations that will need to be done to finalize all the terms prior to the sale. The terms will be consistent with what is outlined in the resolution. When every one of you that I met with asked me, Randy, what does this look like if we go with a fixed rate option? You will see what that looks like. What I want you to understand, though, when you see it is based on an assumption that I gave to them, because you have to make certain assumptions. Knowing that to go a fixed rate option would require additional costs on our part, it would be an additional expense because there are termination fees that you will see shortly associated with our debt that will have to be retired with taxable interest rates. That will be an increased cost. I thought it was reasonable to ask a model be built that in exchange for that increased cost, what does Blount County get for that? And one of the things consistent with our debt policy is that we would be able to, consistent with what every one of you said, is there a way we can shorten maturities? Is to shorten the maturities. And that is one of the models that you will see in the presentation shortly. We just, the lateness of why you got the changes in your packet are a function of negotiations with the banks. The banks that were the finalists have changed slightly. Originally, it was 2 different banks that we'd be doing business with. We were able to negotiate more favorable terms in our favor, and that's what you have in your packet now. In addition to that, the state of Tennessee, I was on the phone with them last night at 6 o'clock and on the phone with them again this morning. We got the letter shortly before 10 a.m. this morning approving our financing request. There was a conditional request that you have in your packet that the commission be fully briefed prior to any vote, and I was able to inform the director that we were actually going to be doing that at 5 p.m. today. They were very pleased with that. So I want you to be aware that when you see the fixed rate assumption, the fixed rate scenario, it's based on some assumptions. And I also want to make sure that you understand the reason that there is some late additions to your packet or modifications to your packet is due to continued negotiations and discussions. Do you have the...
They're just going to run it from our computer. It won't save for whatever reason. The item's plugged in now.
In addition, when I met with you privately, most all of you had questions in addition to the fixed rate discussion, and we've attempted with some of the changes in the resolution to address that, and the rest of those matters will be addressed in the course of the presentation. But the presentation is predicated to give you full disclosure and feedback on what the questions that arose during your meeting with me. And again, I thank you for the time you spent in getting to that point where we are today. To get to this point, there were a team of folks who are responsible for helping get us here. Our bond counsel at Blount County is Bassberry out of Knoxville, and lead lawyer in our bond counsel is Mark Mamontov. PFM is Blount County's independent financial advisor. They don't sell products, they give us advice. And Lauren Lowe, who the budget committee members are familiar with because she's been on a couple of WebExes. And then Josh McCoy, who is also with PFM. They're out of the PFM Memphis office. Where's Josh?
Oh, he's how old is
Josh is loading the presentation. There are other folks with both of those firms, but these are the core group. Then we have been spending a great deal of time, I might add, on getting us to this point. Are we ready, John? Okay. Lauren and Josh will both be leading the presentation. You will see many similarities to the format in what I showed you, and then the modifications and the additions will be pointed out as we walk through the presentation. I think you all need to go to the podium.
As we get our clicker ready, again, I will introduce myself. I am Lauren Lowe with PFM out of Memphis, and I believe Randy did an introduction also of my colleague, Josh McCoy, also out of PFM's Memphis office. We both work directly with Randy and the county on the county's existing debt issuance and the information we've prepared for you tonight. We will tag team the presentation and go through this together. And once we have the clicker, we'll start moving forward and go from... Say next. Okay, I will actually, if you will, I'll try to help IT as we go through this. So please, next.
What we've put together here is, in terms of an outline for you, we've put together a couple charts on the full debt overview of the county. The table here shows by series and issue the outstanding par amount of the outstanding obligations of the county. It does not include any of your qualified school construction bonds, the low interest and 0% interest loans through the state that were issued in 09 and 10, I believe, nor does it include any of your capital outlay notes or capital leases. The chart here shows the underlying debt instrument, whether it's fixed or variable rate debt, and then the effective rate on that, if it's the variable rate that is fixed with a hedge.
Two pieces as I watch you all try to look and see the screen that I would like to point out is the Series E1A bonds, which has an outstanding of amount $50.5 million. It is a variable rate piece of debt that has two synthetic fixed rate swaps, so two swaps outstanding on that piece of debt. And it is currently callable and has a maturity date of June 2037. That is the area that's highlighted green. If you skip down 2 rows below that, you have an area highlighted purple, which is the Series E5A bonds, an amount of $29.3 million. That is also a variable rate piece of debt with two synthetic fixed rate swaps associated with it. It is also currently callable and has a maturity date of June 2030. We bring those to your attention because those will be the two pieces of debt that we talk through as we move into the presentation. The total outstanding is $195,245,000.
And the E5As, that was a joint issue with the hospital, and so the $29 million here represents just the county's piece. It's not inclusive of the hospital. Throughout the presentation, any of the hospital debt is not included here. It's just the direct county obligations.
Next.
There you go.
There we go.
This is just an addition to the slide that you saw before you. The graph to the left shows projected principal and interest payments over the life of the obligations, the blue being the principal and the red being interest. For the variable rate bonds, this just projects interest at a 5% rate, not at a budgeted variable rate or a rate of the swaps. It's just 5%. And then to the right, you have a pie chart there showing your effective capital structure, where you're roughly 49% fixed rate, and then 48% with a synthetic fixed rate, and then 3% of your debt is effectively unhedged without any swaps.
So also, as I want to make sure you see the graphic in front of you, I'll point out that the graphic to the left, you're facing the screen on the left-hand side, is the fiscal year debt service principal and interest. The blue portion is the principal portion, or the portion that repays the outstanding debt. The red portion of the bar graph is the interest portion of the debt service. In 2014, these are on fiscal year basis, it's approximately $13 million in annual debt service. Just to restate, this does seem back to the previous slide that spoke to the total outstanding obligation of the county and does not include the hospital's portion of the E5A bond.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Could you give Lauren that handheld so that we can...
Oh, thank you. Yes, sir.
Speak up. It's hard to pick up.
I don't think she's long enough for reach.
Go Gadget Arms.
Can you hear me? Is this better? Yes. Like Vanna.
We can go to the next slide now. This is a slide that should be familiar to you all. It's an overview of how the swaps work on the variable rate. The county entered into loan agreements with the PBA, which then issued variable rate bonds to bondholders, and then entered into a swap with Deutsche Bank. the swap instrument is where it synthetically fixes your debt, where the county pays to Deutsche a fixed rate and then receives from Deutsche a percentage of 5-year LIBOR and variable rate. And that variable rate receipt is in effect offsetting your variable rate payment. However, there is a disconnect between your receipt of a 5-year versus your payment of SIFMA, which is a weekly rate.
A few points that I would like to make as I look at this graphic. I find it helpful in trying to demonstrate how swaps work. And a few points that I would make that's specifically relevant to the county swaps is that all of your swaps have a counterparty of Deutsche Bank. So one constant factor is that you have a counterparty. I mean, all your swaps are with Deutsche Bank. All of your swaps also are 5-year constant maturity LIBOR-based swaps. So the squiggly line that comes from Deutsche Bank and flows all the way through is the same index of the percentage of the 5-year constant maturity swap. So all of your swaps have that in common. Components that are associated with this debt that should be factored into all analysis and evaluation of these products, or the ancillary fees associated with these products that make them work and be viable to actually remarket and have an investor in the market. Those are in the green bubble, I'll read them out. Remarketing fees, liquidity fees, administrator fees, which are associated with the loans, and the public building authority fees.
So I guess to wrap up the slide here, you see the dotted box around the swap graph there, and the process with the resolution that you'll vote on this evening would allow for the county to issue direct bonds with a direct bondholder, and then we would essentially be eliminating the PBA. And so the Blount County box essentially moves over in place of the PBA box.
And the associated ancillary fees.
No. The table here shows a breakout of the individual swaps. There's 5 swaps in total related to the county on the 3 outstanding series of variable rate bonds. If you look at the name here, you can see, for instance, on the first swap, it says Series A1A and -E3B. The swap was originally issued on the original series of debt was Series A1A. The A1A bonds were refunded with the E3B bonds, at which time the swap moved over and became a hedge on the Series E3B bonds. And so you see that for all 5 swaps there, the notional amounts of each swap, and then the fixed rate that you're paying to Deutsche for each of those respective swaps, and then what you receive from Deutsche as a percentage of the 5-year LIBOR or constant maturity swap, and then the maturity dates of when those swaps would expire. The mark-to-market value is should you want to get out of these swaps today, these are the termination values of those swaps in current market. In total, the termination value is roughly $12.8 million. If you look at the aggregate of the series of bonds that we're looking at, the E1As, the total there is approximately $6.4 million, and the total on the E5As is approximately $2.3 million.
So what I would like to do is, as I think about you all trying to absorb all the information, the numbers and names in front of you, let me walk through this and make sure that you are seeing the same thing that we are putting in front of you and we're on the same page. As Josh mentioned, the first name that you see associated with the summary of the swaps was the original piece of debt. At some point, after the issuance, it was refunded and has a new series of bonds associated with it, which has the new name or the second name after the dash. For the first swap, which, by the way, as we talk through the refinancing opportunity we're bringing in front of you tonight, the first swap that's listed here is not part of that transaction. the line items below it, or the shaded swaps and the debt associated with it, are included with the refinancing that we're pursuing later this evening. But going across the board, the first piece of the Series A1A or E3B bonds, a notional amount of $20 million, in which the county pays a fixed rate of 4.313 and receives 63.4% of 5-year constant maturity. The mark-to-market, or the current value of that swap, if you were to terminate it today, in today's market, is $4.1 million at a cost to the county. The Series A5A, which now is the E1A, $10 million notional amount on the swap. The county pays 3.9%, a fixed rate, and receives 63.2% of 5-year constant maturity. The current value in today's dollars for that swap is $1.4 million. I want to jump down to the very last line item, which is green, because that swap is also associated with the E1A bonds. The notional amount is $39 million. The county pays a fixed rate of 4.27% and receives 63.45% of 5-year LIBOR. The current value of that swap in today's market is $4.9 million, bringing the total for the E1As a termination payment of $6.4 million. The two shaded purples, the two middle swaps, the E5As. First one is the notional amount of $10 million, where the county pays a a fixed rate of 3.264 and receives 59% of the 5-year constant maturity. The value of that swap in today's market is $841,000. The second swap associated with the E5As is the notional amount of $14 million. The county pays a fixed rate of 3.53%, receives 59% of 5-year constant maturity, and the value of that is $1.493 million. And just to be clear, the refinancing opportunity that we are bringing forward for you tonight does not include any modifications or terminations associated with these swaps.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is, should the county want to move forward with a fixed rate and terminate these swaps, they would have to be funded with either cash or taxable debt. You wouldn't be able, talking with bond counsel and tax counsel, you would not be able to finance these terminations with tax-exempt debt. Me or you? Yeah.
So let me give you a little bit of background. Some of this information may be repetitive, but for the broader audience, let me tell you how we got to this point in going through a process and evaluating all options for the county. Earlier this year, the county was contacted by the 10 loans administrator to consider one of the LOCs, the letter of credit, on the E1A bonds and the E5A bonds. Just so you know, a letter of credit is one of those ancillary fees that we referred to earlier. They are a necessity for a synthetic fixed rate swap to work. It is something that your investors require, that there be a letter of credit provider when you have variable rate debt in the market. The county was contacted that their LOC was set to expire shortly, and that the provider was offering a 3-year extension at a cost of 73 basis points. The county contacted PFM as your advisor to evaluate the cost associated with the 3-year LOC. Simultaneously, out of our office, we had been working with some other local governments within Tennessee to price these similar products, a letter of credit, also referred to liquidity fees, and realized that that was likely not going to be a market rate. We had gone through a competitive process for our other clients and recommended that the county revisit the proposed fee of 73 basis points. The revised fee, not through an RFP process, came back at 68 basis points. At that point, the county opted to go through a request for a proposal process in which we we contacted many local banks, many large participants in the market, and asked for a lot of options. We asked for letter of credit options. We also asked for standby bond purchase agreements, which are very, very similar. We also asked if they would provide any other variable rate or fixed rate alternatives that the county should consider associated with the E1A bonds and the E5A bonds. On June 19th, the county received proposals from 12 different banks, in which, in those proposals, most of them had numerous options for us to consider, and also given that there were two series of debt, one piece had a county portion, one piece had a hospital portion, they also offered up multiple options based on those individual pieces. In all, we had 64 options when we evaluated the 12 proposals that could be and had to be evaluated within PFM and with Randy and his staff. Just a recap of some of the proposals and the ideas and the banks that participate in that RFP process. For the E5A bonds, we received multiple proposals for, and for the E1A bonds, just to be clear, for a letter of credit, which was the current product that you had with your current LOC provider. We also received a proposal from one bank to provide a standby bond purchase agreement, or an SBPA. We received multiple options for direct purchases, as well on E5A bonds and the E1As, as well as floating rate notes, and one proposal for a fixed rate bond issue that included termination of the existing swaps. The participants in the RFP process are included in this list. I'll read them off so for the full group's benefit. Bank of Tokyo, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, BB&T, Jefferies, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Piper Jaffray, Raymond James, Sumitomo Mitsui, SunTrust, US Bank, and Wells Fargo. So we're going to have to kind of walk through that.
Yeah. So in looking at the proposals and not just evaluating the cost side, we really want to stress and stress to the county the risk with each option. What you see on the screen is, yeah, I can make it. In the gray box are the inherent risk with each of these structures, and then you have three structures there, left to right. Variable rate demand bonds with either a letter of credit or a standby bond purchase agreement, which is your current structure, or floating rate notes, which is can be entered into either through a direct purchase or through a traditional bond underwriting. With a direct purchase, you have one bank stepping up to the plate, and they're essentially your bondholder, versus a traditional floating rate note where you may have an underwriter that goes and find multiple bondholders for you then to enter into a floating rate note, and then fixed rate bonds. If you think about this, we've lined this up so from left to right, you go from more risk to less risk, and the risk that that you have with these products. If the top hand corner is a bank credit exposure. With, as Lauren mentioned earlier, under your current structure, bond investors require that you have liquidity support, and that's in the event the bonds are ever put back to the county. You have a liquidity provider there that's willing to step up and pay off bondholders when they demand that they be paid back. So your weekly reset rates are going to be and the cost of your variable rate is going to be a factor of your bank's credit rating. So as banks are downgraded, if you have a liquidity provider that gets downgraded, your variable rate cost could increase. With a floating rate note, while you have under a direct purchase, you have a bank as your bondholder, the rate is set based on the terms of your agreement with them, not based on the terms of their credit rating. So your interest rates will not fluctuate with the changes in their credit rating. And then under a fixed rate note, you set a rate at the date of issuance and your rates are unchanged.
So before we leave that consideration, I want to talk a little bit about bank credit exposure and make sure that we understand the information that's put in front of us. On the red area, which is a VRDB, a variable rate piece of debt, which, as Josh has stated, what the county has right now. Should your letter of credit provider, something happen to their credit, that would correlate to a higher interest rate for the county. The floating rate note, which is the yellow portion, the next column over, the one big distinction here is that you are not offering your bonds into the public market where there are multiple investors, meaning you have one investor, it's the bank. They loan you the money at a fixed spread, that you're not relying on the remarketing agent to go out and remarket the bonds every week and be subject to whatever happens in the market, that the county just has to ride it out. That, in this particular product, the bonds go to one investor, which is a bank, and you're not exposed to their credit in the market, meaning where you have a third-party investor being comfortable not only with the county, but also with the bank. And then, as Josh mentioned, the green area, which is on the far right, fixed-rate bonds. Fixed-rate bonds do not require that you have any bank credit exposure. You enter a fixed rate into the market. It's just not a product of fixed rates. So we'll move on to the next one, which is renewal.
The next is renewal risk, and I should have caveated before, anything with a box with a check mark indicates that risk does in fact exist with that structure. So renewal risk is the risk that you have to renew your liquidity once the term expires. So for instance, in your current structure, your BB&T facility was, your current liquidity facility was set to expire. So you run the risk that your current facility provider no longer has an interest in your credit and no longer wants to renew, or you run the risk that the market is that none of the banks have the ability to offer credit. And so you contain that risk under a traditional variable rate structure, and you contain that risk with a floating rate note structure. The risk isn't there in fixed rate bonds. You've issued the debt, the rates are set, and that's what you pay till maturity.
So typically in the red area, which is the variable rate demand obligation, the LOC, or the standby bond purchase agreement, the term tends to be 3 years. At that point, after 3 years, you have to find a replacement or renew with that current provider. So there is some risk and consideration around that renewal. With the floating rate note, those terms really mirror the LOC market, because that was actually what banks developed in response to the banking downgrades from several years ago. They offered these products where they said, we'll come in, we'll lend you the money directly. You don't have to go through a process in which you're relying on our credit in the market. So the floating rate note program also has a typical 3-year offering from a bank, in which in 3 years rolls down and you have to then renew with that current provider or go through a process and solicit another provider to come in and to replace them. That is not the case with fixed rate debt. That is, you don't need those products. The next one is remarketing risk.
Remarketing risk is the risk that your remarketing provider isn't performing well, and that can impact your pricing. In a traditional variable rate market, your bonds are remarketed either in a daily mode or a weekly mode, sometimes even a monthly mode. And so at each reset, your remarketing agent's job is to go and find investors and essentially bid the rate at each reset, at each weekly reset, and set the rate that the bonds will accrue interest for the next week. Most times your bondholders will be the same. The rate will just reset based on the short-term index. And so the risk is that the remarketing agent could be performing poorly and not resetting your bonds at the market rate, and you contain that risk under a traditional variable rate or VRDB structure. In a floating rate notes, while your rate resets every week, that term is agreed to on the front end with the direct purchaser, and your rate resets based off a fixed spread off the index. It doesn't change for the whole life of the term. So there is no remarketing agent isn't required. You don't have to pay the fees for a remarketing agent under the structure, and the risk is is not there. And then again, in a fixed rate, it's not applicable.
I would also complement that with that remarketing risk often dovetails with the bank credit exposure, which is the first section that we covered, because in the event of your LOC provider, so a third-party bank, something happens to their credit, it becomes very challenging for your remarketing agent to be able to go out and solicit that same type of investor base when Bank X, whatever, was downgraded 1 notch, 2 notch. Their investor base then diminishes because of that credit quality challenge. So they're somewhat related in consideration is that you do have an exposure to twofold. Something happens to the bank's credit, and then in turn it's very hard. It's a challenging remarketing opportunity for the county based on that third-party exposure to a bank. And the next risk is put risk.
Put risk we touched on earlier. It's the idea that bondholders under a variable rate structure have they have the ability to put the bonds back to the county, which is why you need a liquidity provider. And many issuers that have variable rates witness this in the credit crisis. And excuse me, I lost my train of thought. It's where the bondholder puts the bonds back to you, and then at which point within your bond documents there are provisions that should the bonds get put back to you and you have to draw on your liquidity provider, your rate's no longer at the short-term index. It becomes a bank rate, which is usually 4% plus prime, or a max rate of 12%. So your interest rates can spike under that time period. With the traditional VRDBs, you retain that risk of that the bonds can be put back to you. Within a floating rate note product and structure, that risk is eliminated. Again, you've set the terms at issuance with your bond, with the direct purchaser, and regardless of what happens in the credit markets, and if bondholders are not wanting to be exposed to the variable rate market, you have an agreement with the direct purchaser, and the risk is not prevalent. And then fixed rate bonds, again, is not applicable.
So key distinction, VRDBs, multiple investors, remarketing, multiple investors need to be comfortable with the credit, have the ability to put the bonds back to you at a whim based on market conditions. The difference with the floating rate note is you have one investor, the bank. They don't have that ability to change their mind based on market conditions halfway through, next week, next month. Last consideration is interest rate risk.
Interest rate risk is just the exposure to the variable rate market and its volatility. Compared to a fixed rate, if you're in a fixed rate bonds, if variable rates go up or down, you don't care. You've already issued your debt. The rate's fixed. But you still maintain interest rate risk in both floating rate notes and traditional VRDBs. The rate resets off of an index. If left unhedged, then the volatility is much more. The idea of the hedge, while you're paying a variable rate to bondholders, you're also receiving a variable rate from your swap counterparty. So the interest rate is somewhat mitigated with the hedge, but the county does still have a portion of its debt that is unhedged, and so the risk is prevalent with both VRDBs and a floating rate note.
Just to be clear, a hedge is also an interest rate swap or a derivative.
Thanks.
Oop. Hold on, I went too far. I gotta get my clicker back. That's right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So now that we've kind of outlined the risk and discussed with you, we've shown the variable rate cost analysis that we've put together, looking at our recommendation of a 3-year floating rate note, in this case a direct purchase with the U.S. Bank, who's a low-cost provider in the bidding process. And the numbers here show your do-nothing case where you stay in your current VRDB product, you continue at the current liquidity fee rate. You continue to pay your admin fees, your marketing fees, and your PBA fees. Under the do-nothing scenario for the E5As, again, stressing that this is just the county's portion of that series of debt and excludes the hospital. Your remarketing fee is currently 10 basis points. Your liquidity fees are currently, under a do-nothing scenario, would be 68 basis points. You don't have a bank spread. Your admin fees are 23 basis points, and then the PBA fees are a half of a basis point. A total ancillary cost of roughly 1% for the E5A bonds, and based on the current par amount, that's a cost of $295,000
A year.
That percentage basis points would be unchanged, but as debt's paid down, on a dollar basis, your total ancillary fees would go down proportionally. Under the direct purchase floating rate note scenario for a 3-year term, you would eliminate, from the prior slide we discussed, you don't need a remarketing agent, so you would eliminate your marketing fees. You no longer need a liquidity provider, so you eliminate liquidity fees. Under the current structure that we're moving forward with, or that you have before you to vote on tonight, we would refund the debt out of the PBA structure, direct obligation of the county, and out of the, and therefore the loan administrator would go away with those fees, as well as the PBA fees. So you move from roughly 1% additional cost per year on top of the variable rate cost to 41.5 basis points, which is the bank spread that you pay to the direct purchaser, in this case U.S. Bank. That cost is would roughly be $121,000 for an annual savings in just the next year of roughly $175,000. On the E1As, it's the $50.5 million issuance. The fee structure is slightly different, with a total cost of right at 96 basis points. Again, that would go to 41.5 basis points for a total cost savings in year one of roughly $275,000. In total, the annual savings and cost savings, I want to stress that cost savings, you still have the variable rate product here. The cost savings is almost $450,000 the next year. If you take that out over a 3-year period, comparing a 3-year letter of credit variable rate structure that you have now versus a 3-year term with U.S. Bank, that savings is, the cost saving structure would roughly be $1.3 million.
Annual savings, $449 a year, $449,000, 3 years, $1.3 million.
The other tenure that we looked at here is that Lauren mentioned that we received multiple proposals from multiple providers, which what we also received is not only did U.S. Bank and other banks provide just a 3-year term, they provided cost for a 4-year term or a 5-year term. In this case, U.S. Bank's max term that they were willing to go out was 4.5 years. And in a 4.5-year direct purchase, their proposal was at a bank spread of 51.5 basis points, so a 10 basis point increase to the 3-year term. So for a 1.5-year longer tenure, the 10 basis point increase would save you annually approximately $370,000 versus the $450,000, or over a 3-year time period, $1.1 million.
And the $370 is inclusive of both pieces, the E5A county portion only, E1A bonds. 370 a year, 1.1 over the next 3 years.
So just two things to point out here, the difference between a 3-year and a 4.5 year. The 3-year term proposed by U.S. Bank was for 41.5 basis points plus the 71.2% of 1-month LIBOR. Their 4.5-year term was at a 10 basis point increase, but also it was a 75% of 1-month LIBOR, not 71.2%. And so, if you want to go to the next slide.
Trying really hard.
Here you go. The next slide here just kind of attempts to demonstrate for you that as you have a higher variable rate market, you're paying not just a 10 basis point bank spread increase, but if variable rates were to increase, the cost difference between a 3-year and a 4.5 year would increase because that applicable factor of the LIBOR goes from 71.2% to 75%. So if you look at current 1-month LIBOR is approximately 18 basis points. Under a 3-year facility, your variable rate cost would be roughly 54.5 basis points. Under the 4.5-year tenure, your cost would be 65.1 basis points, a difference there of roughly 10.7 basis points. If you were to then look at that, an analysis, and look compared to what's the 10-year average of 1-month LIBOR, and how does that affect our rates? Well, the 10-year average of 1-month LIBOR is roughly 1.94%, and that gets you an indicative rate under a 3-year term. It would be roughly 1.8% versus under a 4.5-year term of 1.97%. So your cost isn't just your 10 basis point increase if rates were to go up. It could be, in this scenario, as high as, an additional 7 on top of that. In looking at all of the options that are available to the county, we didn't want to overlook and not analyze a fixed rate refunding analysis. Your debt policies have a stated goal to move towards that structure and eliminate the swaps where cost effective. The analysis of looking at a cost comparison between a variable rate structure and a fixed rate structure can be quite challenging. And typically when analyzing this for clients, we look at just the risk side because historically variable rates are going to give you a lower cost structure compared to fixed rates. In your current variable rate portfolio, the moving pieces that fluctuate with time are those ancillary costs that we went through before. Your liquidity fees have to be renegotiated every 3 to 5 years. Remarketing fees can change if you get a new remarketing facility, or your current remarketing facility could come back and increase their fees. You pay a short-term variable rate, but yet you're receiving a 5-year variable rate on your swaps, so that adds to the complications. And then your swaps are not complete mirror images of your bonds, meaning you're not 100% hedged. You do have a portion of your variable rate portfolio that's unhedged. So in our analysis, what we've assumed is that your current ancillary costs remain unchanged over the life of the bonds. And then we've looked at the variable rate legs of this over 2 different analyses. One is that we took a historical average of the variable rates over since 1993, and then we looked at the variable rates in current market and looked at if you were to compare your variable rate structure till maturity with these assumptions versus what that would look like fixed rate with terminating your swaps, what does that look like as well?
So the recap of this is there's a lot of moving parts associated with the county's portfolio. I'm not going to be I'm going to be very candid with you all. We did make assumptions. The assumptions we made were that the cost that you pay, the green bubble we referred to earlier, that they all stayed the same for the life of the debt. We all know that they actually would change. I don't know where they would go, so I made the assumption they stayed the same. We also made an assumption as to where variable rates would go. We assumed current market rates, and we took the average rate since 1993, which is as far back as our database would go. So.
It's more of an art than a science.
Oops, hold on. There we go.
So what we have here is what a fixed rate comparison looks like. We've broken this out between the E5As and the E1As, and then broken it out by looking at variable rates, historical averages, and then the current market. So versus a fixed rate versus a do nothing scenario where you continue your variable rate structure. Let me back up. I wanted to caveat. In looking at this analysis, Randy requested that we look at, we know the fixed rate's going to be a higher rate. It's going to cost you something. So let's try and get something for that. And what we've looked at is, to what degree can we accelerate some of this fixed rate, some of this debt, and pay it off earlier, and keep the projected tax increase in single pennies. And so our goal here was, how fast can we accelerate the debt, but keep the rate increase under 10 cents? So that's what we've done. The analysis of a do nothing scenario, and this is the E5As. This is terminating the associated swaps with taxable debt, and then refinancing the variable rate with tax-exempt debt. The total debt service increase under a do nothing scenario is roughly $800,000 in those first few years. And then the total debt increase is only $135,000. So that sounds weird, but if you look at the graph there, the green bar charts there are the fixed rate scenario, and you can see that in 2028 there, you pay off the debt roughly 2 or 3 years earlier. And so in 2028 and 2029, you have roughly a $5 million savings versus a cost. So under the scenario, fixed rate compared to where you are now of doing nothing, looking at historical variable rate averages, $800,000 increase, total increase of $135,000. If you then compare that to where you could be with cost savings of all the fee reductions, the increase in debt service is roughly $1.1 million a year over the next several years, for a total increase of roughly $5 million. Same series of bonds, same analysis, attempt to accelerate the debt faster, but instead of historical rates, what about current rates? In current rate market, the debt service increase is a little bit higher. It's $1 million a year for the E5As, for a total increase of $3.6 million, versus the direct purchase scenario, $1.2 million a year, for our total increase of $6 million.
And just to be clear, the difference between the two, current market rates, very low historically. Those variable rates have been higher than the market we're at right now.
The E1As are the bigger piece of bonds of $50.5 million. You can see from the chart here that the principal there, there's a few principal payments in the 24 through 28 range, but most of that debt isn't paid off until 2032 and out. So the analysis there not as much ability to accelerate the debt and still keep it under the taxing, a 9-cent tax increase. If you recall back to the earlier slide, the swap terminations here was over $6 million, so a lot more a lot more taxable debt here. The cost increase, the average increase in debt service annually compared to historical variable rates is roughly $726,000 for a total debt increase of $17.4 million. Under the scenario of the direct purchase, that goes up to an average increase of $1.2 million in average annual debt service versus a total debt service increase of $28.8 million. Again, same analysis, the E1As, except a comparison of the fixed rate versus current variable rates. The numbers there, 1.4 million increase in average debt service versus a do-nothing scenario, or total increase in debt service of 32 million. And then the direct purchase scenario, 1.5 million average annual increase versus a total debt service increase of almost 37 million. So in conclusion, the county has a number of options. It could choose to do nothing. Our recommendation is that you move forward with a direct purchase to refund to a direct loan. That structure does not preclude you from in the future fixing out the debt when the economics might be better, or the will to do a tax increase is there as well. Or the third option is to refund to a fixed rate, and based on those numbers that we just put together and the revenue increase from a penny that Randy had shared with us, a fixed rate scenario would, we estimate, require a tax rate increase up to 8 cents.
The only thing I would add to this is, as number 2 which is the recommended structure, which is a refunding into a direct purchase or a privately placed FRN, actually does save the county money on an annualized basis. While option 3, which is a fixed rate alternative, albeit reduces all risk, comes with an expensive price tag because of the association of the swaps and the termination payment in the current market.
One of the things that I want to remind the commission is we have an adopted and stated debt policy that is publicly noticed as is required by state law. And we have, I think, achieved with the recommendation part of the goals stated in that policy. One is we want to have less variable rate exposure, so that reduces our risk. So the recommendation achieves that. The second thing we want to do is simplify our debt structure. And if you adopt the recommendation that is before you, we have accomplished that by removing the conduit issuer, which was the Blount County Public Building Authority. And then the third thing we've accomplished is, while not removing the swaps, which is another stated goal, we have saved money on an operational basis in our debt service fund if you approve the recommendation. I will apologize for the difficulty in reading this. I'm just glad that we at least went through it in this level of detail. This is the type of detail that the state suggests that all elected bodies see prior to voting on a matter of this type of financing.
This concludes the call of the meeting. We'll stand adjourned until 7 o'clock.